Tonight, we descend into the year 1829, deep within the lawless borderlands of Delaware and Maryland. Here, one woman built her empire not from wealth or honor, but from blood. She was a hunter of men, a predator who turned the desperation of freedom seekers into her own profit. Her name was Martha Bellamy. To some, she was a matron of the frontier. To others, she was a whisper in the night, a figure whose crimes were so gruesome that her very name became a curse. This is her story, a story of betrayal, murder, and human lives traded like coin. The Bellamy house stood like a fortress of decay on the edge of Maryland's farmland. Built of timber that had weathered too many seasons, its shutters rattled in the wind, and its cellar doors seemed to breathe with the damp air of the marshes. From the outside, it looked like the home of a stern, widowed matron, a woman hardened by frontier life. But within, its walls hid a darkness deeper than the swamps surrounding it. Martha Bellamy ruled this house with an iron hand. She was broad-shouldered, her face lined from years of toil and cruelty. Locals said her eyes could freeze a man mid-step, her stare as sharp as a blade. Her family had long been involved in the shadow world of human trafficking, but Martha had taken it further than any before her. She did not simply sell, she hunted. The house on the borderlands was a trap. For enslaved men and women who had fled from southern plantations, the marshy Delaware border seemed like a passage to freedom. It was close enough to the free states of the north that whispers of safety hung in the air. But safety was an illusion, and Martha Bellamy knew how to play it well. Her house became a lure. She offered shelter to the desperate, promising food, rest, and safe passage further north. But those who stepped inside never saw freedom. Instead, they were chained in the cellar, their cries muffled by the thick walls and the roar of the swamp winds outside. By day, she traded in fear. By night, she traded in blood. Martha did not merely capture runaways to sell them back into slavery. Her cruelty went further. Some she tortured, others she killed outright. There were stories of shallow graves dug in the woods, of bones surfacing in spring floods, of screams heard across the marshes when the moon was high. Her accomplices were no less monstrous, men who prowled the border roads, dragging back any soul who dared to run. They were paid in whiskey and coin, their loyalty bound by greed and the terror Martha inspired. The Bellamy gang, as locals would later call them, became a legend whispered in fear. Travelers spoke of seeing wagons roll out from the house at midnight, the faint shapes of chained figures inside. Some wagons returned empty, others never returned at all. The local authorities turned a blind eye. Many profited from Martha's dealings. Others feared her reach, for her wealth bought silence, and her ruthlessness bought obedience. The house on the borderlands grew infamous, yet it never fell. For every rumor, Martha had an explanation. For every accusation, she had a way to make the accuser vanish, but shadows do not remain buried forever. In 1829, whispers began to grow louder. Farmers stumbled across remains in the marshes, skulls half buried in mud, bones gnawed by animals. Children spoke of strange lights near the Bellamy property. Travelers vanished from roads too close to her land. And though the law still hesitated, the community began to sense what lay beneath the surface, a predator in human form. Martha Bellamy had turned her house into a slaughterhouse, her life into a trade in flesh. Yet for years, she remained untouchable. But history does not forget. And the horrors she created would one day be exposed, dragging her name into infamy. The marshlands of Delaware and Maryland were more than swamps and shadowed forests. They were hunting grounds, wide expanses of reeds, black waters, and winding dirt paths where the cries of birds and the hum of insects disguised far darker sounds. For Martha Bellamy and her gang, these marshes were not obstacles. They were tools of terror. By day, the land seemed empty, almost desolate. But at night, the marshes came alive with the movement of desperate figures, enslaved men and women fleeing plantations, guided only by whispers of freedom to the north. The Underground Railroad was little more than a rumor here, a fragile lifeline of trust and secrecy. Yet where there was hope, Martha Bellamy saw prey. Her accomplices patrolled the back roads with lanterns, muskets, and dogs, trained not for hunting game, but for human flesh. They set traps in the mud, iron teeth that clamped down on ankles, leaving escapees writhing and helpless until the gang returned to drag them back. They tied ropes across narrow footpaths so that the fleeing fell hard into the reeds, where waiting hands seized them in the dark. It was not enough for Martha simply to capture. She needed to instill fear, to remind the enslaved population that escape was futile. Survivors spoke in hushed tones of hunters who laughed as they chased their quarry through the swamps, firing shots deliberately wide to prolong the terror. Some runaways were hanged from trees along the border roads, their bodies left as warnings, swaying in the night wind. Each act was deliberate, each cruelty calculated. Martha's reign thrived not only on profit, but on reputation. Fear itself became her weapon, spreading faster than any wanted notice or bounty. The Bellamy gang's hunting grounds stretched far and wide. From Delaware's marshes to Maryland's shadowed woods, no path to freedom was safe. Local taverns carried whispers of missing travelers, not only escaped slaves, but free black men and women kidnapped from northern towns and dragged southward into bondage. Even poor white laborers vanished, their disappearances explained away by drunken accidents or the perils of the swamp. In truth, many were caught in the nets of Martha's operation, their lives sold away or extinguished in the depths of her cellar, yet still the law remained silent. Officials were bribed, neighbors too fearful to intervene, and so the swamps became a theater of cruelty where Martha reigned unseen, her shadow cast over every trembling step taken by those desperate enough to run. But shadows, however long they stretch, are never endless. Beneath the cover of night, a different network moved, small, hidden, and fragile. The whispers of abolitionists, the footsteps of those who guided escapees, the coded songs and signs that carried hope northward. And though Martha's hunting grounds seemed inescapable, her cruelty would, in time, awaken forces far stronger than her fear. For now, though, she remained untouchable, and the marshes remained her domain, a place where freedom was hunted and hope was drowned in black water. The Bellamy farmhouse stood like countless others scattered across Delaware's countryside, modest woodwork, shutters weathered by storms, smoke curling faintly from its chimney. To any passerby it seemed unremarkable, but beneath its floorboards, past a narrow stairwell hidden by a trapdoor, lay the true heart of Martha Bellamy's empire, the cellar of chains. The air down there was heavy, damp with mildew and the stench of unwashed bodies. Flickering lanterns cast uneven light across stone walls, revealing rows of iron shackles bolted into place. Rust and blood mingled where metal had bitten into flesh. The floor was packed dirt, uneven and wet, absorbing every drop of sweat and every muffled cry. Here, Martha stored her captives. Some were fugitives torn from the marshes, others free black families kidnapped from towns to the north. Many were children, their faces hollowed with fear, their wrists raw from the weight of chains too heavy for their small frames. They were crammed together in suffocating spaces, forced to wait for their fate like livestock awaiting market. Martha visited often. She carried with her not compassion, not even curiosity, but control. Her footsteps on the wooden stairs signaled a shift in the air, a ripple of dread that silenced even the faintest sob. She inspected her prisoners as one might inspect goods, prying mouths open to check teeth, gripping arms to test for strength, watching with cold satisfaction as her presence broke their spirits. But it was not always about profit. For Martha, cruelty itself was currency. She devised punishments for those who resisted, ensuring that defiance was smothered quickly and completely. Some were denied food for days until their bodies collapsed from weakness. Others were beaten and dragged to the edge of death, only to be revived and forced back into the cellar to serve as living warnings. The neighbors who whispered about the Bellamy farmhouse could never have imagined the scale of suffering that festered beneath it. And yet, there were rumors. Strange cries carried on the night wind, wagons arriving under cover of darkness, leaving with no cargo in sight. The occasional traveler who entered the house but was never seen again. Still, no one dared investigate. Fear bound the community as tightly as the chains in Martha's cellar. To accuse her meant inviting retribution, brutal and final. Better to stay silent, better to look away. The cellar was more than a prison. It was a crossroads. From here, Martha's captives were sold southward into the deepest reaches of bondage, or, in darker cases, never left alive at all. For those who entered, the chances of freedom vanished into shadows. Yet in every corner of history, even in the darkest pits, there lingers a whisper of resistance. And in Martha's cellar, among the groans and rattling chains, seeds of defiance began to stir. By the early 1820s, Martha's name carried weight, though never spoken loudly. Farmers, tavern keepers, and hired men across Delaware and Maryland knew of her shadow. She had become the hub of a sprawling, ruthless operation, the capture, transport, and selling of human lives. Her network of accomplices stretched across back roads and hidden waterways. Some were greedy men willing to trade morality for coin. Others broken souls bound to her through debt or fear. Together they formed a silent army, sweeping through rural villages and marshlands, hunting for the vulnerable. The method was always the same. Wagons outfitted with false compartments trundled through dirt roads, driven by men who looked like harmless traders. But inside, behind concealed panels, captives lay gagged and bound, stacked in suffocating rows. The wagons made no noise but the creak of wheels and the muffled groans of despair. Martha oversaw every detail. She planned the routes, marked the safe houses, and arranged bribes for officials willing to look away. She was not just a participant, she was an architect of suffering. Her cruelty was sharpened by calculation. Each abduction was traced, like ink on a map, ensuring her profits flowed while her victims vanished without a trace. But trails, no matter how carefully hidden, leave stains. In towns near the Chesapeake, whispers grew. Families of the disappeared searched desperately for their kin, their cries echoing in courtrooms and church halls. But evidence was scarce, and those who dared name Martha Bellamy found their warnings dismissed as rumor, or silenced entirely. Bodies occasionally surfaced in swamps or shallow graves, bound at the wrists or beaten beyond recognition. Some bore marks of iron shackles identical to those in Martha's cellar. Others were left as carrion in the woods, a silent message to anyone who might interfere. The blood trail widened, crossing county lines, touching rivers and coasts. From Delaware to Virginia, fragments of her empire spread like veins, pulsing with misery. Each step forward meant another life stolen, another family torn apart. And yet, for all her cunning, Martha could not fully control the voices of the haunted. Survivors, few as they were, carried stories. They spoke of nights chained in wagons, of escape through swamps, of the woman whose gaze cut like a blade. Their testimonies drifted like smoke, hard to contain, reaching the ears of abolitionists and lawmen alike. A fragile resistance began to grow. Networks of free black communities, aided by sympathetic allies, spread warnings of Martha's hunts. Lantern signals lit the marshes, coded knocks sounded at doors, whispers passed in markets, signs of people refusing to be silent. For the first time, Martha's empire faced shadows rising against her own. But Martha was not a woman to be rattled. If resistance grew, so too did her savagery. Those suspected of aiding fugitives vanished in the night. Their homes were burned, their corpses left as proof. For every attempt to unravel her network, Martha answered with blood. The land itself seemed cursed by her presence. Forest paths felt heavier, as though the trees themselves remembered the weight of chains dragged through them. Marsh waters reflected the moon with a sinister stillness, concealing bones beneath their surface. Roads once familiar became haunted by the thought of her wagons rolling silently through the fog. Martha Bellamy had made the world her hunting ground, and for a time, no one could stop her. The farmhouse looked ordinary from the road, weathered. Wood, a slanted roof, and smoke rising lazily from the chimney painted the picture of rural life. To passing neighbors, it was nothing more than another homestead on the Delmarva Peninsula. But inside, it was something far worse, a fortress of cruelty, a place where walls absorbed suffering until they seemed to breathe it back. The cellar was only the beginning. Beyond it lay rooms that bore silent witness to horrors no language could fully capture. Wooden floors were marked by deep gouges, as though fingernails had clawed desperately for escape. Dark stains seeped into the grain of the boards, never fading, no matter how many times they were scrubbed. In one locked chamber, shackles were fastened not only to walls, but to the very beams of the ceiling, suspending captives like grotesque displays. The iron cuffs, heavy and rust-stained, bore grooves where wrists and ankles had bled against them. Buckets placed beneath were not for mercy, but for catching what dripped from the suffering above. Another room held chains arranged in circles on the ground, designed to bind multiple people together so tightly they could not move without bruising one another. The air reeked of sweat, iron, and despair. A single barred window allowed light to enter only in fractured shafts, as if even the sun recoiled from what lay within. Martha did not merely imprison, she experimented. Witnesses later spoke of punishments designed less for discipline and more for amusement. She would starve captives for days, then force them to watch as food was set just out of reach. Others were made to march endlessly in circles, chained to posts, until exhaustion brought collapse. Whispers claimed she relished psychological torment as much as physical. Children were separated from their mothers, forced to endure their cries, unanswered. Songs of sorrow, once used by captives to maintain hope, were silenced with gag and whip. Each act was meant to strip humanity away, to reduce her victims to shadows of themselves before they were sold, discarded, or destroyed. The farmhouse itself began to change, as though absorbing the weight of so many broken lives. Neighbors, even those complicit in her trade, noticed strange things. At night, faint cries seemed to leak through the shutters, echoing across the fields. Farmhands reported tools misplaced, doors opening without touch, and livestock refusing to approach the cellar. Some swore that on moonlit nights, shadows lingered in the upstairs windows long after the rooms were empty. But Martha, hardened by years of violence, cared little for such whispers. To her, fear was useful. It kept others from prying too closely. The rumors built a barrier as strong as any lock, ensuring few dared step inside without invitation. And when they did, they often never left. Among her victims were not only those she intended to sell, but also those she suspected of betrayal. Disloyal accomplices, curious travelers, even local officials who questioned too much. All found their way into the farmhouse, and all were silenced within its walls. Their remains vanished, fed to the earth beneath the floorboards, where damp soil kept its secrets well. By 1829, Martha Bellamy's house had become more than a dwelling. It was a graveyard disguised as a home, a monument to unchecked power. Every nail, every beam, every stone carried echoes of the lives it consumed. Yet history teaches us that no empire of terror stands forever. In the darkened corners of her home, beneath the stench of fear, seeds of her undoing were beginning to grow. By the late 1820s, Martha Bellamy's empire of fear had reached its peak. Yet with power came visibility, and with visibility came danger. For years her name had been spoken only in whispers, her deeds buried beneath fear and silence. But silence, like soil, cannot cover everything forever. The first cracks appeared in the form of rumors spreading beyond her immediate reach. Abolitionist groups, already growing louder across the region, began to hear scattered accounts of entire families disappearing from free black settlements. The stories carried chilling consistency: wagons seen at dusk, distant cries in the night, and the name of a woman who orchestrated it all. In taverns and markets, her accomplices, once loyal out of greed or terror, began to falter. Some boasted drunkenly of their earnings, their words slipping into the ears of those who listened closely. Others, racked by guilt or fearing their own betrayal, quietly passed information to those determined to stop her. But it was not just outsiders who stirred against Martha. Within the walls of her own house of death, something had changed. A handful of captives, hardened by survival and bound by desperation, had begun to plan. They studied her routines, the movements of guards, the moments when shackles were checked, less carefully. Each day of torment became a lesson, each lash of cruelty a spark of resistance. At the same time, lawmen began to take notice. While many were complicit, bought by bribes or silenced by threats, there were those who could not ignore the sheer scale of disappearances. Reports landed on desks, dusty and unremarkable at first, but soon forming a pattern too grim to dismiss. Eyes turned toward Martha Bellamy's property, and suspicion grew heavier with each passing week. Martha sensed the shift. She had built her life on reading others, on sniffing out weakness. Now she smelled it in her own circle. Her temper grew volatile, her punishments more severe, as if brutality could hold back the tide of consequence. She lashed out at anyone she suspected of disloyalty, ensuring loyalty through terror. But in doing so, she sowed seeds of rebellion. Her farmhouse, once a fortress, became a pressure chamber. Accomplices eyed one another with mistrust. Neighbors whispered too loudly. Travelers gave her land a wider berth, and even her wagons began to draw suspicion as they creaked along familiar roads. The shadows that once protected her now threatened to betray her. Then came the incident that marked the beginning of her true downfall. A wagon was intercepted on a rural road after a wheel cracked and broke. Inside, concealed compartments spilled open before witnesses, revealing captives bound and gagged, their eyes wild with terror. The driver, one of Martha's men, was seized, his frantic attempt at silence overpowered by the undeniable evidence of human lives stolen. Word spread like wildfire. For the first time, Martha's empire could not be hidden behind rumor or fear. The facade crumbled, and the reality of her crimes spilled into the public eye. Martha, however, did not flee. Pride, or perhaps delusion, anchored her to the farmhouse. She believed she was untouchable, that her name, wrapped in terror, could still shield her. But in holding her ground, she unknowingly set the stage for her ruin. The law, the resistance, and the whispers of the haunted were closing in. The woman who once hunted others was now the one being hunted. By 1829, the net around Martha Bellamy had grown too tight to escape. The intercepted wagon had exposed her trade, and the testimonies of the captives within its walls confirmed what many had whispered for years. Names were spoken, places described, and the web of complicity began to unravel. Authorities who had once turned blind eyes found themselves under pressure. Churches denounced the horrors, abolitionists cried for justice, and families of the missing demanded action. The climate had changed, and with it, Martha's power began to wane. Her farmhouse, long a fortress of cruelty, became the focus of growing suspicion. Neighbors watched as men gathered at its borders, not with quiet acceptance, but with grim determination. The fields that had once concealed her wagons now carried the tread of boots moving against her. Martha, defiant to the last, fortified herself within. She refused to abandon the home where she had built her empire of suffering. But her confidence, so long her weapon, faltered as she realized her accomplices were vanishing. Some captured, others fleeing to save themselves. The loyal circle she had relied upon was crumbling into dust. When the raid finally came, It was swift and brutal. Lawmen and volunteers surrounded the farmhouse in the early hours, moving under a heavy dawn fog. Doors were splintered, windows shattered, and the rooms that had held generations of misery were laid bare. The cries of freed captives rose through the chaos, mingled with the crash of gunfire and the crack of whips repurposed as weapons of resistance. Martha fought with a desperation that bordered on madness. Armed with pistol and blade, she struck out against those who entered, her rage a final performance of the cruelty she had long commanded. But rage cannot withstand numbers, nor can terror protect against justice when justice finally wakes. She was dragged from her home, kicking, spitting, her screams echoing against the very walls that had once carried the screams of others. Her trial was brief, though her crimes were not. Witnesses testified, bodies were uncovered, chains and implements of torture displayed before shocked crowds. The farmhouse itself stood as evidence, every scar on its walls a testament to lives consumed within. Martha Bellamy was sentenced to death. Yet even at the gallows, she wore her pride like armor. She spat defiance at the crowd, cursing those who dared judge her, as if her name alone should have been enough to silence them. But the rope tightened, and with it, her empire of cruelty ended, or so it seemed. In the years that followed, the farmhouse was abandoned, left to rot in the Delaware marshlands. But those who dared approach spoke of strange sounds, chains rattling in empty rooms, cries rising from beneath the floorboards, shadows flickering in broken windows. The land bore the weight of too much suffering, and even after Martha's death, it refused to let go. Travelers avoided the road that passed her property. Hunters claimed their dogs whined and refused to approach. Farmers swore that the soil near the farmhouse yielded nothing but weeds, as if cursed by the blood spilled upon it. Some said Martha's figure could still be seen in the upstairs window, watching, waiting, her fury unquenched even in death. Thus, her legacy was sealed, not merely in history books, but in the haunted whispers of a land scarred forever. Martha Bellamy's reign of terror ended on the gallows, but the shadows she left behind continue to stretch across time. And so we close this story, yet the echoes remain.